Have you ever seen a photograph that felt wrong? Not because of what it showed, but because of what it shouldn't show. In 1944, a young sailor named Thomas Mitchell stood on the deck of the USS Nashville and smiled for a simple photograph, a keepsake for the fiancée waiting back home in Ohio. But decades later, when his family looked closer, they found something impossible hidden within the frame. In the distance, the faint outline of ships and skies that did not belong to his time, and the trace of a future he could never have known. What followed would consume 3 generations, a father's obsession, a son's discovery, and a mystery that seemed to stretch across the very fabric of time. Scientists, historians, even physicists would all try to explain. Yet the photograph still refuses to give up its secret. Tonight, we'll drift back across 70 years of history, through war memory and something far stranger, to trace the haunting story of Thomas Mitchell's final photograph. Because sometimes history doesn't just record the past, it catches a glimpse of what's yet to come. Sometimes history keeps its secrets close, waiting for the quietest moment to let them breathe again. Tonight's story drifts back to the Second World War, and to a single photograph that would trouble one Ohio family for generations. This is the true account of Thomas Mitchell, a young sailor from Marietta, Ohio, and the photograph that changed everything his family thought they knew about their past. What you're about to hear is drawn from real letters, family records, and preserved military archives, pieces of a puzzle that have waited over 80 years for someone to look closely enough. It's a story about memory identity, and how a single moment caught on film can whisper questions that time alone cannot silence. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? And if you enjoy stories like this, quiet, unsettling ones that linger long after the lights go out, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next mysterious tale. Thomas Mitchell stood on the deck of the USS Nashville, watching the Pacific Ocean stretch into endless blue. It was 1944. He was only 22, yet he had already seen more of the world than anyone from his small Ohio town could ever imagine. The warm, salt air tugged at his dark hair as he adjusted his white sailor's uniform, checking his pocket watch, a gift from his father before deployment. Mitchell. The voice came from across the deck. Petty Officer. Rodriguez, smiling. Mail call in 5 minutes. You got that letter ready for your sweetheart. Thomas smiled faintly, patting the breast pocket of his uniform where he kept his most treasured thing, a small black and white photograph he planned to send home to his fiancée Helen. 3 days earlier, he'd asked another sailor to take it, a simple portrait against the vast Pacific. Helen had written, teasing, that the only picture she had of him was from boot camp, and he looked far too serious in it. Now, as the USS Nashville sailed toward the Philippines, part of the Pacific campaign, Thomas spent his off hours writing letters and dreaming of home. He thought about Helen's laugh, about the smell of his mother's Sunday apple pie, about the creek behind their house where he and his younger brother Robert used to fish until dusk. As he made his way toward the mail station, he noticed Seaman First Class Johnson, the ship's unofficial photographer, sorting his gear beside the communications post. Johnson's camera, an old battered Leica, had captured months of life aboard the Nashville. "Hey Johnson," Thomas called softly. "You mind if I ask you something about photography?" The man looked up, smiling behind his cigarette. "Sure, Mitchell. What's up?" Thomas pulled out his photograph, and held it carefully. I took this to send home to my girl. Think it's good enough. The light? Okay. Johnson examined it closely, holding it to the ship's grey light. At first he said nothing. Then his expression changed, a slow, quiet frown. Where exactly did you take this? Mitchell. Right over there. Thomas pointed to the starboard railing. 3 days ago. Around sunset. Why? Johnson hesitated. You sure it was 3 days ago? Positive. Tuesday evening, just before mess call. Bradley took it for me. The photographer ran his thumb over the glossy paper. This'll sound odd, he said slowly, but I've been shooting this ship for months. Every angle, every change in light. And this, he tapped the edge of the photo, doesn't match anything I've seen. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Look at the background, Johnson whispered, pointing. The clouds, the way the sunlight hits the water. I've taken shots from this same spot dozens, and the light in this one, it doesn't make sense. It's not sunset. It's either early morning or very late evening. Thomas blinked. Maybe it's just the film. Johnson didn't answer right away. His eyes traced the image again. And another thing, your uniform. My uniform. Here in this photo, it looks brand new. Crisp. Like it just came from the supply officer. But I've seen you in it, Mitchell. That one's been through the wash a few times. Thomas's stomach turned slightly. I don't understand what you're saying. Johnson finally handed the photograph back with a soft shake of his head. Probably nothing. Cameras play tricks sometimes. Light and shadow can fool anyone. It's a good shot. Your girl will love it. That evening, as the ship rocked gently against the Pacific swell, Thomas sat on his bunk beneath the faint hum of the engines. He began writing a letter to Helen, the photo resting beside his pen as the light overhead flickered once, then stilled. The conversation with Johnson had left Thomas uneasy. But war has a way of forcing men to set aside their unease. There were more immediate things to think about: the coming operations in the Philippines and the dream of returning home safely to marry Helen. That night, as the ship hummed quietly beneath him, Thomas began his final letter. My dearest Helen, I'm sending along the photograph you asked for. I hope it shows you that I'm well and that I think of you every single day. The Pacific is beautiful but lonely without you. I count the days until I can hold you again. He sealed the letter, slipped the photograph inside, and added it to the outgoing mail pile. Within a week, it would begin its long journey home across the ocean, across time toward a small house on Maple Street in Marietta, Ohio. Meanwhile, in another corner of the ship, Seaman Johnson sat on his bunk, turning over the memory of that photograph. There was something about it, something off, that he couldn't name. He took out his small journal and wrote a single entry. Strange conversation with Mitchell about his photograph. Technical anomalies I can't explain. Must remember to follow up. He would never get the chance. 2 weeks later, during a night engagement near Leyte Gulf, the USS Nashville came under heavy fire. A shell struck the engine room, the place where Thomas Mitchell was working his shift. He was one of 17 sailors killed that night. The ocean kept its secrets. 3 days later, the photograph arrived in Ohio almost in step with the telegram that announced Thomas's death. Helen Henderson, soon to be Helen Mitchell, before fate intervened, lived in a modest two-story home on Maple Street. She worked at the munitions factory, one of thousands of women holding the home front together while waiting for their men to come home. On that grey October afternoon when the telegram arrived, her world fell apart. The sky outside was colorless, silent, as if even the wind refused to intrude. She was still in shock when the second envelope came, the one bearing Thomas's handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, folded with such care, was his photograph. Thomas smiled back at her from the paper, so young, so alive, the Pacific light caught in his eyes. It was almost unbearable that he could look so present when she already knew he was gone. Helen placed the photograph on her bedside table, and there it stayed for the rest of her life. She never married. Instead, she dedicated her years to caring for Thomas's parents and preserving his memory. Visitors would sometimes find her sitting by the window, the photograph in hand, retelling the story of her brave sailor lost to the sea. Time moved on. The war ended. The veterans came home and the small town of Marietta rebuilt itself around the names, etched on a bronze plaque in the new Veterans Park, Thomas Mitchell among them. Helen became a familiar face there, helping to organize memorial services, tending the flowers that grew beneath the names of the fallen. And when she passed away in 1987 at the age of 68, she left behind her small estate and everything she had kept of Thomas, his letters, his keepsakes, and that single photograph. Her nephew David Henderson inherited it all. He had always been fascinated by the stories his aunt told about her lost fiancé and the war that had taken so much. David was a high school history teacher, passionate about World War II and the quiet heroism that filled its empty spaces. After Helen's funeral, he spent weeks sorting through boxes of papers and photos she had preserved so carefully. One evening, he began scanning the old photographs into his computer, hoping to save them before time faded the ink and the edges for good. That was when he noticed it, the photograph. Thomas's last photograph appeared on the screen with far more detail than the original print had ever shown. David leaned closer. Then he called out to his wife, Linda. "Come look at this." Linda, a nurse at the local hospital, walked in and glanced over his shoulder. "What am I looking at?" "This," David said quietly, "is the last photograph Uncle Thomas sent home before he died. But look closely at the horizon." She leaned in, squinting, and there, faint, almost invisible, was the outline of a ship. Not a vessel of the 1940s. Its shape was too modern, too sleek, like something from decades later. "That's probably just another ship in their convoy," Linda said. "That's what I thought too," David murmured. But according to the records I found, the USS Nashville was alone in that sector. No other American ships were within 100 miles that night. He spent the next few days poring over naval archives, matching maps, comparing weather data, even looking at cloud formations from October 1944. And what he found only deepened the mystery. The photograph showed Thomas standing proudly on the deck of the USS Nashville. David could identify every detail, the railing pattern, the alignment of the deck planks, even the faint markings on the bulkhead behind him. All of it matched official Navy photographs taken in 1944. All of it except what lay beyond the ship. The background didn't belong. The horizon The light, even the shape of the clouds, none of it aligned with the Nashville's documented location that October. And the more David compared, the stranger it became. In the National Archives, he found something that made his hands tremble. A collection of photographs taken by Seaman Johnson, the ship's unofficial chronicler from the very same section of the deck. Johnson had photographed everything: the machinery, the crew, the ocean's endless reach. And yet, his images, though taken from the same railing at the same angle, showed an entirely different world behind them. Different skies, different waters, different light. It was as if Thomas had stood in the same place, but not in the same moment. The mystery took hold of David like a fever. He contacted naval historians, sent copies of the photo to imaging experts, and even began searching for surviving crew members of the USS Nashville. Most were in their 70s or 80s, now their memories softened by time. Only one seemed to recall Thomas with any clarity: an elderly radar operator named Robert Chen, living quietly in San Francisco. David reached him by phone one evening. "Mr. Chen," he began, "I'm researching a sailor named Thomas Mitchell. I believe you served with him." There was a pause, the faint hum of a distant refrigerator, and then a soft laugh. "Sure, I remember Tommy. Good kid. From Ohio, right? Always talking about his girl back home. Helen, wasn't it?" David smiled faintly. "That's right. He died near Leyte Gulf. I'm calling because I'm trying to understand a photograph he took just before that." Another silence. Then Chen's voice dropped to a thoughtful murmur. "You know, that's funny you mention it. There was something strange about Tommy those last few weeks." David felt his pulse quicken. "Strange? How?" "Well," Chen said slowly, he started talking about things that hadn't happened yet. He'd ask if we remembered seeing a destroyer pass off the port bow, only we hadn't seen one. Or he'd mention a storm we'd supposedly ridden out the week before, but the weather had been clear for days. It was odd. Like he was just a little out of sync with the rest of us. David's pen hovered over his notebook. Did anyone else notice? A few of us did. We chalked it up to exhaustion. Everyone was stretched thin by then. But Tommy? Sometimes I'd catch him staring at the sea like he was listening for something. Like he knew what was coming but couldn't say it out loud. Chen's words lingered long after the call ended. David closed his notebook slowly, his heart unsteady. If what Chen remembered was true, then Thomas's final days had been marked by something more than combat fatigue, something that didn't fit the rules of time. David began documenting every clue, every letter, every photograph. Over the next several years, the mystery grew into 3 thick binders, a private archive of unanswered questions. He didn't know what he was searching for: any more proof, maybe, or peace. But in 1995, a new set of eyes would see what his could not. His son Michael had just graduated from college with a degree in digital imaging technology, a field Thomas could never have imagined. When Michael came home to visit, David told him the story that had haunted the family for nearly a decade. The young man listened quietly, then said, "Let me take a look. I can run the photo through professional software, clean it up, see what's really there." Hours later, long after midnight, Michael called out from his study. "Dad, you need to see this." On the screen, the photograph shimmered in new clarity. The grain reduced the background, sharper than it had ever been in print. David leaned close. At first, he thought he was looking at another ship, but then his breath caught. The vessel in the distance wasn't from 1944. It was modern, unmistakably so. A cargo ship complete with towering communication arrays and a hull design that wouldn't exist until at least the 1970s. "This can't be," David whispered. "That design, it didn't even exist during the war." Michael nodded, his voice low. "I checked. It's not just a fluke of light. The geometry matches 20th century commercial ships. And there's something else." He zoomed in on Thomas's pocket watch, barely visible in the corner of the photograph. The hands were clear now. 3:47. But according to his letter, David murmured, he said it was taken at sunset. That would be around 6, maybe 7 p.m. "Exactly," Michael said. And I ran a light analysis. The angle of illumination on his face and uniform doesn't match evening light at all. He paused, the glow of the monitor flickering in his eyes. It matches early morning light from a latitude that wasn't recorded anywhere near the Pacific. Not in 1944. The room fell quiet. Only the soft hum of the computer filled the air, a modern echo to an old mystery that refused to rest. Michael leaned closer to the monitor, the glow of the screen flickering faintly across his face. "The shadows and highlights are wrong," he murmured. "They're consistent with mid-afternoon lighting, not evening." Then he paused. "And Dad, look at this." He zoomed in further, the image softening pixel by pixel until something faint appeared in the pale sky behind the ship. A thin, straight line, almost invisible at first glance, cut across the horizon. When enhanced, it was unmistakable. A jet contrail, stretching wide and perfect across the Pacific air. Michael's voice fell to a whisper. Military jets didn't fly at those altitudes in 1944, and none left contrails visible from sea level. David stared at the image in silence, his thoughts unraveling faster than he could contain them. "What are you saying?" he finally asked. "I'm not saying anything," Michael replied softly. "I'm just showing you what's there. This photograph, it holds pieces of a time that shouldn't exist in it." That night, David couldn't sleep. He thought about Robert Chen's warnings about Thomas's confusion during those final weeks aboard the USS Nashville. Could there really be a connection between that confusion and the impossible photograph his uncle left behind? By morning, the question had become a decision. David would find every living crew member of the Nashville. He would retrace its final mission line by line, archive by archive. Somewhere he believed an explanation waited, something that would make sense of the photograph that defied both history and reason. His search consumed years. He traveled from state to state, sifting through military archives, interviewing aging veterans whose memories flickered like old film reels. Most dismissed his obsession as a son's wishful thinking. But one woman, Dr. Sarah Martinez, a physicist at Ohio State University, did not. After reviewing his files, she sat back in silence, then said quietly, "Mr. Henderson, if what you've gathered is authentic, this could represent what some call a temporal displacement event." David's breath caught. Meaning, she said that your uncle may have experienced a brief overlap between his own time, 1944, and another. The photograph might have captured both realities at once. It sounded like fiction, and yet it explained everything. Dr. Martinez spoke of quantum irregularities of relativity and stress, how extreme conditions might tear small holes in time itself, just long enough for one moment to bleed into another. Not time travel, she clarified gently. More like time remembering itself. By 2001, David had built an archive of staggering scale, hundreds of documents, dozens of interviews, fragments of testimony that refused to align neatly with the accepted past. The most haunting came from William Buck Rogers, the ship's communications officer, now an old man confined to a veterans' home in Phoenix. I remember that boy Rogers said, his voice brittle but clear. Near the end, something changed in him. He came asking for radio parts. We didn't have modern ones. Swore he'd seen them in use. Rogers stopped, eyes fixed on something invisible, then added softly, and there was the business with the photograph. David leaned forward. What about it? He asked about time zones and message delays. Rogers said he'd gotten a message from home, but the timestamp didn't make sense. When I checked the logs, there was nothing. No personal messages at all. What kind of message? Rogers shook his head. He never said. Only that his family had received his final photograph before he'd even taken it. For a long moment, the room was silent. Then Rogers looked up, his eyes clouded with the weight of years. He said time was moving backward, that he could see things that hadn't happened yet. That confession became the final piece of David's puzzle, one that pointed to something neither science nor history could comfortably explain. Somewhere in the still air above the Pacific, a moment in 1944 had brushed against another century and left behind a single photograph to prove it. The photograph had captured something that should have been impossible. A single frozen moment holding proof of a man's fleeting glimpse into a future he would never live to see. David Henderson died in 2007. His life spent chasing the truth behind that image. He never published his findings, never earned recognition for his years of work. When he passed, the worn boxes of notes, interviews, and photographs went to his son Michael, now a digital forensics expert, as patient and meticulous as his father had once been. Michael continued the investigation, using technology his father could only have dreamed of. In 2015, deep within the pixels of his uncle's final photograph, he found something extraordinary. With modern image analysis software designed for criminal investigations, he uncovered faint shapes hidden in the haze of the horizon. The unmistakable outline of a modern, nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. A ship that would not exist for another 20 years. Michael realized the image was layered like overlapping transparencies of time itself, fragments from different eras somehow pressed together in a single instant. It wasn't just a photograph anymore, it was a rift. But rather than chasing scientific validation, Michael took another path. He wanted to understand not what Thomas saw, but what he experienced. And when he turned to the USS Nashville's medical logs, he found something that chilled him. Thomas Mitchell had reported vivid dreams that felt more real than waking life. He told the ship's doctor he saw events unfold before they happened. Flashes of the future during ordinary routines. The entries dismissed it as exhaustion, as combat stress. But Michael recognized it immediately, classic descriptions of what physicists once called temporal displacement. Thomas, it seemed, wasn't the only one. Several crew members had complained of similar disorientation before the ship's final battlemen, who worked in the engine room, near radar stations, in areas alive with electromagnetic energy. All had spoken of time seeming to blur, and all had died in the same attack that killed Thomas. Michael began to wonder, could the Nashville itself have drifted into some kind of temporal disturbance? A brief fracture between moments caused by combat and electromagnetic fields, allowing flashes of the future to bleed through the present. Thomas perhaps had simply been the only one sensitive enough to recognize it. And when he lifted his camera, he had unknowingly preserved that fracture, an impossible instant where different centuries met on a single strip of film. In 2018, Michael donated his father's lifetime of research to the National Archives, thousands of pages, witness statements, scientific notes, and the original photograph itself. To this day, it remains one of the most mysterious images in American military history, a young sailor from Ohio smiling on the deck of a World War II ship with the faint shadow of the future hovering behind him. Thomas Mitchell never lived to see the world his camera captured. He died in combat 2 weeks later, his final letter arriving home to Helen before news of his death reached her. For nearly 70 years, his family chased the truth behind that photograph, a truth that continues to whisper through the archives, defying logic, bending time, daring those who see it to believe. The image still exists, carefully preserved, resting in a climate-controlled vault. Visitors can request to see it. Most don't notice anything unusual at first. To the untrained eye, it's simply a black and white portrait of a sailor against the Pacific horizon. But look long enough, and the sky behind him seems to hold something else. A shape, a shimmer, a ghost of the future, waiting to be recognized. In Marietta, Ohio, Thomas Mitchell lies beneath a modest stone that reads, Thomas Mitchell, U.S. Navy, 1922-1944. Beside him rests Helen Henderson, his fiancée, who waited 74 years to be reunited with a sailor. Their graves overlook the creek where he once fished as a boy, the same town where the impossible photograph finally found its way home. It remains one of history's quietest enigmas, a moment caught between what was and what would be. Proof, perhaps, that under certain conditions, fear, grief, light, or war, the boundaries of time can tremble. And sometimes, a human being may see beyond them if only for a breath. Perhaps Thomas Mitchell's greatest legacy wasn't his sacrifice in battle, but the photograph he left behind. A reminder that even in the stillness of history, the universe keeps its secrets, and sometimes, just once, it lets one slip through the lens.